Geraint.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Minette, you mentioned earlier on that food inflation is 10%, that inflation's 10%, that food inflation is 15%, that input inflation is 30%, and therefore you said basically the costs are being absorbed largely by the producer, and therefore the quantity of production will be reduced and available. What would have you any sort of projections on the total supply of food from UK producers this year versus next year?
We're already seeing, liquid milk down 1% in volume. I think it's probably fair enough to say without the power and strength of Arla in the marketplace, moving the market forwards, we could have well been in a very, very different place on that. On the protected crop sector, as I said earlier, you've got the lowest level of production since records began. Field veg, we should be producing a lot more of it here. Why would you as a grower when you can take all of that risk out? Livestock, we are seeing a vast majority, 40% of our members, which is quite unheard of, saying that actually they are going to be having less beef and sheep. So we are seeing contraction pretty much across every sector. Now, a lot of that is lack of certainty. And the phrase that we've used is we've got to put our arms around production and give them confidence. They want the confidence, they want the certainty, and then they will produce. Any business, it doesn't matter what you're producing, if you are facing into huge risk, there's a limit to how long you're going to keep producing below the cost of production. So eggs, many people will be seeing that playing out right now. We've got a shortage of eggs. So we've got to come together to be able to deal with this and incentivise the market. I don't know whether you're planning on coming on to it, but the conversations around affordability of food, I've faced into many challenges that has talked about imports of cheaper food to fulfil the marketplace that we have. And I've always felt that is a very flawed argument. And you look at the value of the pound on the back of everything that we're dealing with, and indeed right now it doesn't stack up as something to do. So we've got to look at that. With the current CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, you cannot talk about price. It is illegal for me to be in any meeting talking about price. And I do feel that is slightly the elephant in the room. When I had the Americans over to see us last week, they were astounded that with our competition law, we are prohibited from having those conversations. And ultimately, we need to be able to have them. And we need to be able to look at how we intervene in the market, which of course, totally different competition law in the US. They can intervene in the market, which drives out a lot of volatility. That's a big discussion to have, but it hasn't been had. And having left the EU, it's probably one that ought to be had.
Yeah, it does seem to me that, or you may know that since 2014, food production from Russia has grown by something like 15% since the time there were some sanctions due to Crimea. So Russia's resilience and the food production is much, much greater than it was. And yet, since the Ukraine episode, it seems that what we're being told is, but partly for the input costs of fertilisers and the gas, etc., that we're looking next year at a much smaller productive capability for the UK in the midst of this global conflict. I mean, how much lower do you think it could fall to if nothing's done?
I think it's impossible to know, quite honestly. I think what we can say is that the gas market is going to remain very volatile. There are things that we could do, and I said it at the beginning, if we could actually find some certainty in the price of gas, it would help a lot for the longer term. So I think it's impossible to forecast, but this is going to remain the situation for the foreseeable future. And of course, climate change, we haven't mentioned that at all. We are facing into ever more volatile weather events across the world. And if you look at harvest, what happened in India, what has happened in China, you're seeing far greater challenges globally. If you take Ukraine and Russia out, that are responsible for 30% of global wheat exports, that is hugely significant, not least, 70% of sunflower oil as well. So these are all things that are here to stay for the time being. And, there's a lot that we can do. And I'm conscious in everything that we say, actually, we are better off than many member states in Europe. We've still got the backup of nuclear. We've got a very good renewable sector. We're probably not going to face rationing how they are in Europe. But I think we need to look at all of those tools for how we drive inflation down in what is a very gas-hungry sector from farm to fork, which is the food industry.
But do you feel that the government should make some sort of broad statement to give the confidence to the producers who are absorbing all these costs, and then saying, hold on, this doesn't make sense, I'm going to pull back and pare down my production? Some sort of statement or some proposition from the government to say, we want to give the industry confidence. Our objective is to at least keep production at the same levels for next year, and we'll do whatever policy interventions we need to make sure that happens. Would that be a helpful start point?
There are multiple levers that could be pulled immediately that would make a huge difference. And, you know, I have been personally talking about access to seasonal workers. We're talking about 70,000. We've had 30,000. That could be resolved tomorrow. And that would give a lot of certainty to growers who are literally moving their businesses abroad. On field veg production, it's not going to be easy, but we could incentivise field veg production. There are multiple levers that could be put in place that would provide a level of certainty. But I don't think for a whole chain we have ever felt so bereft of any policy levers. And when I talk about a plan, it has been the plan for food production that has been missing. And it's not been the fault of anyone, perhaps, but you know, we've worked with 3 very different governments.
And again, you mentioned that Ukraine and Russia's got something approaching 30% of global wheat exports. And my understanding is that in Russia they've reduced the price of fuel and gas and oil to farmers and other people to enable it to have food production in the south of Russia, basically feeding people in the north of Russia. And so suddenly the transfer costs are becoming more affordable within Russia, stimulating again the overall amount of production of food in Russia. And at the same time, the impact of what they're doing in the Ukraine in terms of energy prices is basically making farmers produce less in the UK. Isn't that something that should be acknowledged by government and taken much more seriously?
Well, I think that all comes into the wider food security piece. I mean, talking to our opposite numbers in Ukraine, you know, they're facing into the fact that probably 40% plus of the cropped area will not be planted. They've been told specifically by the Ukrainian government that actually they have to focus on their feeding their own people and growing things that will fulfill their own food security challenges rather than exporting. So, you know, I'm not so familiar as you are with what is going on in Russia, but in Ukraine, you know, it's having already huge global impact, and they are going to have to concentrate on their own food security. That's certainly what they've been told, and they are growing other crops that fulfill that.
And finally, do you feel as a strategy we should be aiming to become more self-sufficient, given that we suddenly realise the risks of you know, critical inputs that Ed was mentioning, for instance, that we should be looking at somehow producing these things to actually manage risk at home?
I think without any shadow of doubt. You know, we're an island nation. We've got an enormous population. We've got a population of 70 million people. There are enormous opportunities that Ed has alluded to around building resilience. You know, more solar on rooftops, that would make a huge difference. Individual turbines within farm holdings. You could make farms far more resilient and less reliant effectively on importing. They could build their own sort of circular economies, but we have to deal with it all in the round. And if we downsize our self-sufficiency, which has been predominantly static at around about 60% for the last 2 decades, I think it would be to the enormous detriment of this country, especially facing into the global challenges that we are. So we have to look, and I said earlier about a statutory framework. Again, the Prime Minister committed to that back in August. I realise the world was different in August, but that's really, really important so that it gets factored into local plans, planning requirements for new buildings. If you want higher welfare standards, you need bigger buildings. So all of this must be joined up together. And you know, time is not on our side to do that. There is a real level of urgency.